Public schools were all segregated by race. Earl Warren said that's unconstitutional in 1954. From that point on, we're in a different country. One of the reasons the 1950s is so popular is because there was a sense of fairness about American prosperity. Now, of course, not everybody in the 1950s was equal in the same way, was treated equally, I should say. The 1950s was really the last decade in which so-called Jim Crow segregation was legal. Right through up the 1950s, Black and white Americans lived in two different worlds. They were kept apart by segregation, the system we sometimes refer to as Jim Crow. Why is this relevant to the Eisenhower story? Because surprisingly, Dwight Eisenhower played a big role in dismantling segregation in the United States. Now, he didn't know much about this issue when he came into office. Eisenhower, he grew up in a very white town of Abilene. He spent much of his life in the United States Army, which of course was entirely segregated by race throughout World War II up until the late 40s. He didn't really know much about Black life in America. Where was his favorite place to go to play golf? Augusta National Golf Club in Georgia. Augusta National was totally segregated. It didn't allow Black or women members until the 1990s. So think about that. He wouldn't have picked this as an issue. But in his 8 years in office, the United States went through a really significant change with respect to race relations. And I'll just mention a few things. Right away in 1953, he says, we're going to desegregate Washington, D.C. because the federal government should not support segregation. That was what he believed. And so they were able to desegregate federal property in the nation's capital. He also would appoint 5 appointees to the Supreme Court. Ike got 5 appointees to the Supreme Court, one of whom was Earl Warren of California. And Earl Warren he was the Chief Justice, and he proved to be quite a liberal on race relations. Earl Warren would write the Brown versus Board of Education decision that would begin the desegregation of public schools. Public schools were all segregated by race. Earl Warren said that's unconstitutional in 1954. From that point on, we're in a different country. Now, segregation in the public schools would continue, but it would be illegal, and it would be all too gradually, rolled back as a result of Eisenhower's appointment of Earl Warren and Earl Warren's decision in Brown versus Board. And then Eisenhower took an enormous risk in 1957. In 1957, the state of Arkansas, through the acts of Orville Faubus, the governor, wanted to protest against the desegregation of public schools. And they picked the sort of case of the high school in Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. And Orville Faubus says, hey, we're not going to desegregate this school because that would cause disorder. That would cause mob violence. Well, Eisenhower decides to make a case of this. And he says, look, it's not the state's choice as to whether or not to obey federal law. Federal law has been declared by the Supreme Court, and the states will follow it. And he sends National Guard troops and he sends airborne troops to Little Rock to surround that high school and to protect the Little Rock 9, those 9 Black students that wanted to enroll in the high school, and allow them to go to a public school in their own hometown. Now, this is not the Eisenhower you would have predicted. He would not willingly have chosen this moment, but it came to him, and he did the right thing. He could have stood in the way of progress. He didn't. He helped it move forward. That's a legacy I think we should champion and welcome. So I've mentioned 3 areas where I think Eisenhower is really a significant figure in American life. His foreign policy and management of the Cold War. I think he's hugely important there. The way he managed the economy and American abundance while also guiding the economy in a fair way that benefited everybody and not just the wealthy. And also on civil rights, where he paved the way. He didn't create the changes, but he paved the way for changes and for the civil rights movement to gain momentum. And it would reap those rewards in the 1960s in a later decade. Now, I'll just mention in closing that, we could criticize Eisenhower for a few things. And I'll just mention a couple of what those things are. One is, of course, he gave us Richard Nixon. He put Nixon on the ticket in 1952, and he probably shouldn't have. He didn't really know Nixon. When he got to know Nixon, he didn't really like him, and he didn't really trust him. And even when Eisenhower was very ill with his heart attack, he never turned over the presidency to Nixon, even though he was under anesthesia numerous times. He just didn't really trust him. So it's sort of odd that without Eisenhower, I don't think Nixon ever would have become president. But Ike gave us Nixon, and maybe he regretted that decision. I'm not sure, but my sense is that he never was fully behind the idea of Nixon as his successor. A second area where Eisenhower comes in for a lot of criticism is with respect to McCarthy and McCarthyism. This is Senator Joe McCarthy of Wisconsin, the infamous Red Hunter. And Eisenhower, we all believe, should have criticized Joe McCarthy more. In fact, he held back a lot during 1953 and 1954. He didn't go toe-to-toe with Joe McCarthy and denounce his style of politics. And many people have criticized Ike for this. I think the reason was just tactical. Joe McCarthy was a Republican. Eisenhower didn't want to alienate the right wing of the Republican Party. He needed them to help him get legislation through the Senate. He didn't want to pick a public fight with a senator. He felt that would demean the presidency. They weren't equal, So he stayed away from it. Behind the scenes, he tried to help undermine McCarthy, but he never engaged publicly with McCarthyism. And a lot of people feel that he should have used his prestige to criticize McCarthy, which he didn't do. And there's always been criticism about that. And then the third area where I think we can justly criticize Eisenhower is indeed what those historians of the 1980s said, where Ike used covert operations to overthrow governments around the world. These are pictures of 6 men with whom Eisenhower had significant interactions or dealings, overthrowing governments in the case of Arbenz on the top left, or in the case of Mohammad Mossadegh in the top center in Iran. Eisenhower and his CIA overthrew their governments, even though they were democratically elected governments. He pursued assassination attempts of Fidel Castro in the bottom right, and in the bottom center, that's Patrice Lumumba of the Congo. He was eventually murdered in the Congo while he was prime minister, but it wasn't by Americans. It's just that his enemies inside the Congo got to him first, but the CIA was planning for his overthrow and possibly his murder. Ngo Dinh Diem on the top right became a puppet of the United States in South Vietnam during the Eisenhower period, and Sukarno on the bottom left here was a figure that Eisenhower also tried to roust out of office by funding a rebellion inside Indonesia. So all I'm saying here is that Eisenhower did use the CIA to pursue American national interests in ways that we would now find kind of clumsy, indeed embarrassing, maybe even illegal. And he's always gotten criticism for this, and I understand why, and I think that's fair criticism. Well, I want to wrap up our talk today just by reminding you that, in my view, Eisenhower was one of the most interesting and significant presidents of the post-1945 period. He left office and he gave that wonderful military-industrial complex speech, the farewell address in January of '61 as he's leaving office. And basically he was trying to say, look, we're in a Cold War. It's an existential struggle. We have had to create this thing called the military-industrial complex. It's too bad. But at least we have leaders who know how to control it and how to govern it. And we should never allow the military-industrial complex that we've had to build in order to wage the Cold War to overcome our democracy. It was a little bit of a warning saying, watch out before businesses and the defense establishment takes over our democracy. It was kind of a strange downer note to leave office on. I think he was also warning the public that John Kennedy was pretty young and inexperienced, and we should watch out. But nonetheless, that's one of his signature moments when he is quite prophetic about the danger of the Cold War to our democracy. He dies in 1969, and again, as I mentioned at the beginning, many people said then that he wasn't a great president, but I have news for you. In 2017, a C-SPAN poll of hundreds of historians in the United States was published, and lo and behold, Eisenhower was ranked number 5, the 5th greatest president in American history. That is how he is seen today. And it wasn't just a fluke, because C-SPAN ran that poll again in 2021, and again, he was ranked 5th. I participated in it, so maybe I helped juice his numbers a little bit, but he was ranked fifth as the fifth greatest president, only after Lincoln, Washington, Franklin Roosevelt, and Teddy Roosevelt. So that's a pretty amazing company. And I think the reason is because it's his crisis leadership, it's his management of the economy, in many respects, his moral authority and integrity, his relations with Congress, which were pretty good, his attitudes on civil rights, which were quite progressive for the time. All of these taken together give us an image of a popular, of a dignified, a decent, and effective and consequential president, somebody who was not perceived this way at the time, but who we have come over the years to appreciate ever more.